Hi, guys. So, as you might know, I'm part of the White Space Venture Catalyst program for 2026. And I'm doing these series of lectures to talk about some of the takeaways that I'm getting. So, hopefully, it can be helpful to you. This is the second episode. So, the first episode was talking about constant validation. I'll link it below if you haven't seen it. But in this episode, I'm talking about customer discovery. The first thing is, most founders, when you start off, you start with an idea. The thing is, though, is that ideas are just hypotheses. They're not really something that you can bet on as far as it's going to take you to the finish line when it comes to a startup and actually start making money. So the first thing you have to really do is validate those hypotheses. And those hypotheses obviously go with a lot of assumptions as well. So customer discovery is really about turning hypotheses into facts. And if you look at, for instance, the business model canvas, which is one of the canvases we typically fill out, when you first start filling that out, that is more of a hypothesis. These are a lot of assumptions that you're making about, the business model, the customer's pain points, who the customers might be, all that kind of stuff. But what you're really doing during the customer discovery is turning those, as assumptions on that sheet into facts, things that you can actually bet on as you move forward. So that's usually the biggest startup mistake, is to build before actually understanding the customer, because you think like this idea is going to be great, it's going to build. But where the focus should be is actually the problem, because the first step in building a real business is really to understand the customer deeply. So the questions you want to answer are like, who is the customer? And maybe there might be more than one. And these are typically categorized into the customer personas. And then you have to think about, how do they buy? What's the journey that they go through to look for solutions to their particular problems? Another thing would be like, where do they go for solutions? What's their typical path? And you may not be the only person providing a solution for this particular problem that you're trying to solve. So how are they currently going about solving it? Where are they looking? Where are they going to buy solutions to their problems? What channels are they using? And that's very important, especially when it comes to distribution being a big problem when you first start out. So the other thing is sort of like, how do they currently solve that problem? Are they actually solving it? And so you want to make sure you can differentiate in some ways, or address some of the things that they're currently using and also build on top of that. And you also, want to build a product that fits in how people already buy. You don't want to necessarily get people out of their current process of how they do things. That's going to be a little bit more difficult than if you build your product in such a way that fits in how people already buy. Another thing that's very important is how important or serious the pain is. There's a sort of funny quote that says, "Shut up and take my money." And that's really what you're aiming for. You want your product to solve a serious pain. There's another comparison they use is sort of the vitamin versus the painkiller. You want to be the painkiller. You don't want to be the vitamin necessarily, because the pain has to be strong enough that the customer instantly sees value, especially in these early times when you're trying to validate the customer. You want to make sure that their eyes light up, or they say, well, this is exactly the problem we had. So if people are just interested, the problem is probably pretty weak. And that's something to address early on. And maybe you need to make some modification to your idea or your concept. Another important thing is how you go about actually doing that research and doing that discovery. And there's two ways to go about it. There's the secondary research, which is quite available for everybody. You go on the internet, or you use AI to help you do your research. And that's called secondary research, because it's not directly getting that information from the particular customers you're going after. It's sort of like the information that's out there and is accessible. Primary research is where the focus needs to be early on, because you're talking directly with customers. And those are the conversations that actually get you to realizing what kind of problem you want to solve and what type of solution you need to be building for that. So, the typical recommendation is to talk to about 100 customers to really understand the problem. And that's not easy to do, obviously. But the closer you get that number, the more likely it is that you're going to have a very good understanding of what's happening in this industry, in that particular buying journey, whatever it is that you need to understand. 100 customers is going to really get you to that point. And what you're doing during those times, you really are interviewing them. So you're asking them open-ended questions, and you're letting them tell your story about how they work. You ask a lot of follow-up questions. And you might even be asking them a certain question like multiple times in different ways because it might be positioned differently because you want to get a particular angle on that answer. So you really what you're doing in this case, you're listening more than you talk. So you should be allowing that person to talk at least 50% of the time and asking things like why, and then just staying quiet and letting them speak so that you can really understand what's happening. So typically what you're doing here, you're not talking about the product. And this is a mistake I've made quite a lot. And I know other people make this mistake is that you start off with talking about the product. I wish I knew this a long time ago, but the right way to go about it is that not to pitch the product. You really want to understand what their kind of pain points that they're going through. So if you mention your solution, the problem is that the conversation becomes about your idea. And that can sometimes come across a little bit salesy. And nobody wants to be sold to. But what you want to ask for is feedback. What you're trying to do here is really to learn about what kind of experiences this particular person is having. And then in your back of your mind, you're really trying to understand, is the solution that you're trying to create really addressing the problems that they're facing? If when you come in with the ideas like, I got this product and what do you think? And would you like to buy it and stuff? You're not giving that person enough time to actually, or even a chance to really open up about what's really they're experiencing. So it really changes the focus on the conversation. So in the beginning, you want to focus on understanding the problem, not necessarily validate the solution. Validation of the solution comes later. Once you fully understand and you built the right thing and you're adjusting the right problems, then you start going and actually validating the solution as well. So it's sort of a step-by-step process. And a good way to think about it is sort of like an actual scientific experiment. Scientific experiments have a step-by-step process to follow. So as you're going through this process, you're finding the real pain. Customers rarely say directly what their pain is. And so the idea here is they're not going to tell you, for instance, like something costs me too much money in certain cases, but they might describe certain frustrations that they might have with how they use that product or what kind of benefit it gets them. And so when someone talks about the frustration of a particular product they're using and they're saying it's too expensive, they might be talking about the value that they're getting, not necessarily the price. And so the job of an entrepreneur in this situation is to dig deeper. You want to listen and read between the lines. And I mean, this is a very important time where you want to take some either mental notes or just taking actual written notes during the process. And so that you can go back and think about it, because you may not necessarily pick up on it right away, but you go back home and then think about it a bit more. So you want to ask things like, how often does this happen? How much does it cost you? Where is the money lost? So you really want to make sure you bring money into the conversation as far as like what they're currently using, how does it affect their bottom line? Okay, so that's a big one. And just important thing is to treat startups like an experiment. That's something that big takeaway for me is to treat it like an experiment. It is not a definition of whether you're a successful person or not. It is literally an experiment, and you're really thinking about like business as a scientific experiment, and you're running this experiment and you're going to see if it's going to work or not. So the process sort of create the hypothesis and then test them with customers, learn from feedback, and then you adjust. Where you're adjusting on the solution. You're adjusting on maybe your distribution approach. You're adjusting in how you price it, or what kind of value you want to focus on. These are all these adjustments that have to be made, but you can't make them from just doing secondary research. You can't make them by just doing some internet research and thinking to yourself like, okay, now I get what's going on. The very interesting takeaway today was, you can have 10 years experience in the industry and you're still not going to really understand your customer that you're trying to solve a problem for, because your experiences are not necessarily directly related to what they're experiencing. And are they even willing to buy it? That's a very important part too. You could have the solution in front of them and you could be like, look, I got the solution for you. And they might not necessarily buy it. And there might be really good reasons on their side why they're not willing to buy it. Maybe it's not big of a problem for them. And so why would you want to invest? Why would they want to even buy and add on something else? Maybe it's a headache to them to add something on. So there could be a million things, right? So the correct approach is to keep re-examining the problem and then fine-tuning from there. And important thing is to understand the buying process, especially into B2B. There's a lot of roles involved. So things like there's users, there's champions or influencers in the company. There's evaluators, there's the decision makers, right? There's procurement. All these different individuals might be involved in making decision making process. So, but when you're first addressing who should I target first, the most important person is the buyer. That's where you want to start off with. Go after the buyer, but don't ignore these other individuals as well, because they will then later down the road, once the buyer has decided, yes, this might be something you want to consider, you can expect that these other individuals will get involved in that decision making process. So the buyer obviously is, just to repeat myself here, the buyer is the person that writes the check. So make sure you don't discount that important factor. The other thing is very important. In the early times, finding customers can be difficult, especially with people who you want to speak with. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, into cold approaches. But the easiest way, if you can do it, if you can is to use network effects and based on the current network that you currently have. So this can be people from your network. These can be people who are connected to people who you might know, right? So referral is a big one here. So that's really a very important thing to consider, is that it'll be much easier to see if you can build that initial group of customers that you're going to talk to from your network. So finally, the real goal of customer discovery is that you're trying to answer one question. Is this problem big enough to build a business around? That is ultimately what you're going to come down to. As an entrepreneur, you want to make sure that you're making money with the solution that you're solving. So if the answer is yes, then you want to make sure that you address that problem and you build the solution. If it's not, then you want to pivot. So yeah, that was sort of the main takeaways from this lecture. Next week, I'll do another one and we'll move forward. So I'll see you in the next one. Take care.